CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
Hey, what's going on, everyone, and welcome to another edition of CFL 110 here on the Winnipeg Sports Talk channel, your weekly trip around the Canadian Football League. And we've got a lot to get to today. Andrew Paterson along with Jeff Hamilton of the Winnipeg Free Press. Big slate of games coming up this week, but big news happening already this week in the three-down game that we have to get to. We will touch on the latest with the Elks. Moving on from Chris Jones, the Cody Fajardo injury, a huge game for Dru Brown, an absolute classic CFL game in Winnipeg last weekend between the Bombers and the Stampeders, and a big Prairie matchup between the Riders, who lost their first game of the season, and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers ahead of the annual home-and-home, the Labor Day Classic and the Banjo Bowl coming up this week. It's great to have you all with us. CFL 110 is presented by our friends at Garage Living Winnipeg. Really appreciate the support of Garage Living to get more CFL content out on the channel. And a special thanks to our pal Pat Kanuga, who has been getting a lot of great feedback from Winnipeg Sports Talk listeners and CFL 110 viewers and listeners. And they're booking jobs into September already. So if you are interested in finding out more, booking an extreme garage makeover before winter hits, give Pat a call today, 204-999-1234. Garage Living Winnipeg can help clear the clutter so you have a clean, organized, gorgeous space to work, store, but also to hang out. Maybe you have the buds over for the big game on Friday night. And that can happen in just a few days. Garage Living specializes in durable polyaspartic floor coatings, premium made-in-Canada metal cabinets, slat wall, and overhead storage solutions for a functional garage that looks amazing and adds value to your home. Give Pat a call for a free in-garage consultation to find out what is possible. 204-999-1234. And again, whether it's a single, double, triple, a 10-car garage mahal, Pat can come up with a design to meet your needs within your budget. Check them out online. Examples of the amazing work is available at garageliving.com. Again, CFL 110 brought to you by Garage Living Winnipeg. Garages made for living. 999-1234. All right, let's get to it. The Hammer, Jeff Hamilton, with me as always. And I gotta tell you, it was a fun week in the league last week, and I am really excited. We had our first doubleheader of the year, Friday night rematch between the Elks and the Red Blacks, with a different person on the sidelines, which we'll get to in a minute. And of course, then Bombers Riders on Friday. How you doing?
I'm doing awesome, man. I'm in day 3 of my vacation, and I had this like grandiose idea that I was gonna have. Like, I made this big long to-do list like before I went on vacation, thinking, oh man, I'm gonna have this whole week to do things. Now I still have some time, and I'll go back to work till next week, but I haven't been doing a lot. I've been watching a lot of TV, so I've been crushing The Bear. I don't know if you've gone on that train yet. That show, The Bear, it's awesome. I kind of want to consider a job in the kitchen somewhere, but I also got into Hard Knocks. You seen Hard Knocks yet? On the New York Giants and their off season?
You know what? I've just seen a bunch of clips so far. So that's the off-season Hard Knocks.
The off-season Hard Knocks. So they get into it's actually pretty cool, man. It's obviously it's behind the scenes thing, stuff, and that's where the value is. But they talk about pretty candidly those conversations that, you wish you were a fly on the wall for. I mean, all the decision making around key players, they're critiquing guys. Players that they think might be able to, fit their roster. And I'm not just talking potential free agent signings, but college players. They go into the draft. They talk about, guys' personalities and whether it would fit with them. And of course, I think what drew me there was all the chaos about Saquon Barkley and him moving on and all the kind of the decision that the New York Giants took to essentially let him go, not putting the franchise tag on him. So I've been doing some work, but I've spent a lot of time in front of the TV, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
I haven't. I mean, I watched a little bit of the Derby and a bit of the All-Star game yesterday. I've been watching the CFL games on the weekend, although it'll be easier to get to all of them right now with the soccer finished. I was very much into Canada's run at the Copa, and I didn't see a lot of the BC-Saskatchewan game on the weekend. Other than that, been consuming it all. But you know what has been taking a lot of my time? I pre-ordered EA's NCAA college football game, which came out. And it's amazing. So, I mean, I think the full release is tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. Highly recommend it. It's been a long time since that game's been off. They figured it out. It is phenomenal. The reason I bring it up, though, on the CFL 110, and I would give a shout out to Nelson Hakowicz on X, who I believe is a big-time Rider fan. I think he's a big computer guy. And he tweeted out the new football game is coming out, and he is going to create CFL teams in it. So I'll give him a plug, give him a follow at Nelson Hakowicz if you're getting the game. And I think there's going to be player ratings, uniforms, some stadiums that he's putting together that will somehow be able to enter into the game. And I've already said to my friends at Edmonton Sports Talk, Dustin Nielsen, of course, who calls the games on TSN. We were talking about this on the Lock Shop yesterday. We are going to have the Labor Day and the Banjo Bowl home and home, where Eric, LTE, Dustin's partner, who is the longtime Rider fan from Saskatchewan, he will be the Riders. I will be the Bombers. We will be doing a home and home multi-stream from Winnipeg Sports Talk and Edmonton Sports Talk going head-to-head. And Dusty will do the play-by-play. So we'll be getting some what is happenings going on and much, much more when we put all that together, and it should be fun. But yes, highly recommend. Is that like
when Chicago Fire meets Chicago MD, and they, it's kind of like a cross, what do you call it? A cross
right.
show or whatever, cross
those different CSI shows from the different cities. So anyways, we're looking forward to that. But I highly recommend it. And listen, if we can get the CFL, the one thing I've always wanted is a great CFL video game, and the game is great. If we can put the CFL stuff in there, all in on it. But Jeff, listen, let's get right to it.
Yeah.
The biggest story in the Canadian Football League, and some would say, how did it take so long, was the firing of Chris Jones. And the way the game ended on Sunday, leaving 8 seconds on the clock, kicking it out of bounds to the 50, giving up a quick pass from Dru Brown, who shredded the Elks for 480. We'll get to that later on. And Lewis Ward kicking a walk-off field goal, in a lot of ways, was the perfect end to the Chris Jones era, which another close game, a team that just found a way to lose. And so much of it comes back to the architect of the team and the guy calling the shots on the sideline. And Chris Jones is no more.
You can look at 3 straight walk-offs losses, right? And talk about how close they are, And I mean, you can also talk about how you are, what your record is. And in this case, the Elks are 0-5. The fact of the matter is, Huss, eventually you make your own luck. And you also make your own bad luck. And in this case, I just think Chris Jones just wasn't good enough. I thought it was the perfect kind of send-off in a way. I mean, I don't mean that to be a jerk. I mean, it's, I don't think anybody can look at Chris Jones and didn't think he tried, to bring the Elks back to, some level of respect, but just failed. And I mean, it's just, to me, it comes down to just decision-making. If you look at his tenure as a whole, I mean, 8-33, that's 4-14. Okay, maybe year one, you give them that year thinking we have a lot of work to do here, a lot of building to do. Maybe we shouldn't expect, a skyrocketing up the standings. So 4-14, certainly not good enough. There's not a single person in the building who would disagree with that. And then fast forward to year 2 and it's 4-14, the same thing. We talked about this on a previous show, Huss, when we were kind of going through the Jones saga week in and week out here, wondering kind of when the other shoe would drop, assuming that they continued to collect losses. And I mean, we talked about this before, like Chris Jones said that year 1 was a mistake. It was, he had too many guys coming in and out. Anyone who can recall that season, I mean, I think they had a different starting group on defense
absurd.
and offense every year. Exactly. It almost made what he did in his time in Regina, where he had a complete additional practice roster. I don't even want to say like group of 10. It was like a bunch of players, a B team living in some kind of frat house over in Regina or whatever. It almost made that look like good coaching. And I mean, fast forward to today, and it's just, that first year didn't work. And then the second year was supposed to be this buildup. This supposed to be, the work was going to be laid. And while it was still a 4-14 record and still a year without making the playoffs, which we know is ridiculous in this league, more teams make it than don't. Literally twice as many teams make it to the playoffs that don't make it. That was okay because Chris Jones had finally figured it out. He had the players in. There was a little more continuity to his roster, and now this was supposed to be the year where you hit the ground running. And, you can look at all the different plays. You can look at, all the mistakes that were made, the penalties that were made. Discipline is certainly on the coach. I mean, he's got to get his players reeled in and not being, not going over the line, riding that line as much as possible. You look at it, what was it, a week or 2 weeks ago where he got into the face of a special teamer, and it was just you could tell it was really a tense situation for him, that it was weighing on him. And then, this past game, I mean, you can look at Boris Bede, and man, there's something about Boris Bede where he's got the leg, but like, I could have predicted that was going to happen. He's just the guy who's just not on small details. He's kind of known for that. To see him chumming it up after the game, I think just kind of summed it up for me as far as Boris Bede. But when you look at Chris Jones here, man, I mean, at the start of the game, okay, so they come off a bye week. They pick up a new guy in Derek Moncrief. They pick up a new guy in Sean Oakman, okay, two guys that don't know the team. Two new guys. Now, Derek Moncrief, was in Edmonton before, so there might be some rollover there, but two guys that are new to this unit's team are addressing the entire club before the game as the leader, like coaching them up. Sean Oakman, who got released by Toronto and who couldn't make it into the lineup and then got released, and there was some talk about like personality stuff and whatever. He's now leading the defense, and Derek Moncrief are leading the defense in the chatter, in the pep talk, if you will, leading into that game. Where is the leadership of that team?
Nobody else had anything to say after the last. I can't
picture any team in the entire CFL that would sign two guys in the offseason, let alone make them starters like Derek Moncrief was at strong side linebacker. That's a whole other thing. I get the guy has CFL experience, but to put him in as a starter on this defense right away, it just came down to bad coaching mistakes. And, while it was, close calls throughout this entire season for Chris Jones, this one was the right call to get rid of him.
Hey, listen, we talk a lot about the culture that O'Shea and Walters and Miller have built in Winnipeg, and it seemed like the exact opposite, and that might be the perfect example. I mean, my only thought on that, on the new guys as being the ones that are addressing the team, is that everyone else that's been there through 8-32 up until that point just said everything they could, and they were looking for anybody to say something different that might be different. You're exactly right. Listen, they put so much into Chris Jones, gave him so much power, gave him the stability with the money that he had. They're going to be paying him for another 12 months. He had to come through and with some positive results. And we thought that was going to happen last year. It didn't. I was high on them, and I still think that there's talent in that building. I think MBT, listen, I know there's a love affair with Trey Ford from a lot of a good section of the Elks fans. It's not on the offense right now. And Jones was supposed to be the defensive genius, which makes it look even worse. Now, the other part of this is the fact that the Edmonton Elks, coming out of the pandemic into the Chris Jones era, have been bleeding money, have been bleeding fans, and to the point where a longtime publicly owned team is going to be going to private ownership. And I think the thought was that they're going to need to wait to see what happens with that to finally make the move. It just goes to show how urgent the situation was felt to be in Edmonton, that they had to move off of a guy at 0-5, despite being in and right there in every single game, which moves us on to the legacy of Chris Jones. And we'll get to you can pull up the numbers because they are ugly, but the legacy of Chris Jones, to me, is a guy that pretty much ended the stability of one of the crown jewel franchises in the Canadian Football League and put them in a situation so perilous they're needing to go another route, change the way they've done business for their entire history, and move on to private ownership, which hopefully will be good for Edmonton, because this is a great market. It has always supported its team well, and it should be one of the healthiest teams in the CFL. They are far from it right now, and I know there's some other factors, but it's hard not to look. If you're doing a power poll, the reasons why they are in the situation they're in right now, it's because of the job that Chris Jones did and the fact that this team could not win football games, and everything that was promised was snake oil.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll get into Jones's legacy, but just to touch on a couple of things, Huss. One, I wonder what the future for Trey Ford is for this team. This was a guy who, yes, he's, I am on record saying I think McLeod Bethel Thompson was the right decision to make. I think he brings that leadership, that calmness of a veteran. Trey Ford was a little too, almost too creative, obviously incredibly athletically gifted, and did account for 5 of Chris Jones's wins. Jarius Jackson now takes over from offensive coordinator as interim head coach and offensive coordinator. He did say today or yesterday, I forget which day it was, that he plans to get Trey Ford into a game. He has committed to McLeod Bethel Thompson as the quarterback, but he does want to get Trey Ford's special gifts into games. So it looks like he's going to have a package for him, if not this week, then in the near future here. And of course, G. Roy Simon takes over as interim GM. And I thought it was interesting at the press conference, they kind of asked G. Roy Simon what it could be for a new GM to come in. I thought to myself, G. Roy Simon isn't a new GM. He was a co-GM with Chris Jones. And while, he's going to get the opportunity to take over this position solely, I don't think anybody on that staff is safe heading into next season. So we'll see what they can do, and it starts with getting that first win. As for Jones's legacy, I asked my friends at the in the stats department, particularly Jeff Creever, a former Carleton University fellow graduate, same class. I asked him, look, I'm looking at this 8-33 record. This has got to be up there as one of the worst records over a 3-year season in history, in league history. Sure enough, it is. So if my math is correct, 8-33 comes to a 0.195 win percentage, which obviously is not good. But you look at the other coaches in history, and you got to go back. I don't know what was going on between 1967 and 1969, Huss, but there are 3 coaches during that span who all have just horrendous records. They go to K. Dalton, Montreal, so 67-69, 7-31-4 for a 214 winning percentage. Joe Zaleski with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, same 3-year stretch, 10-37-1 for a .219 winning percentage. And Jim Champion, BC, 67-69, 8-28-2. And so when you start talking about going back literally more than half a century to see this kind of shitty coaching, if you will, for lack of a better term, I mean, it's borderline unprecedented in the last half century. And you look, and it just goes to some of your points, Huss. Chris Jones came in as the savior, and because post-COVID, just given the situation with the Elks, with the name changes, with the instability, with the on the field, off the field, they needed somebody to come in that they thought was going to be a slam dunk. And to your point earlier, Chris Jones was given everything he wanted: title, money, coaching staff. So, you look at the so few examples that exist with him. That's because nobody puts up with that kind of record for that long. And so, you almost got to give credit to Chris Jones for creating a situation.
He covered his ass well.
As much as job security that there is in professional sports, the Chris Jones formula seems to work. But as it comes down to, man, he showed up in Saskatchewan, and then Edmonton, even though he didn't win anything in Saskatchewan, as still the coach that goes and wins everywhere he touched. Beginning in Edmonton in 2015, when he got Edmonton their Grey Cup in Winnipeg, all the spots he had been at before, and including in Regina, he found a place to win. It will be these 3 seasons that I truly believe come to define his record, because you can't call him the winningest coach out there. You can't call him a defensive guru, not with the performance he's had in Edmonton. And who knows if he'll be able to write another chapter and change that narrative, Huss?
Well, and listen, just to finish off the Jones, I mean, we can't talk about Jones in Edmonton and this miserable run that tanked the franchise without talking about what happened the last time he was there. And he won the Grey Cup. Excuse me. He won the Grey Cup with the caveat that a day later took his entire coaching staff to Saskatchewan for more money and left them high and dry. So
totally.
I'm not
They
sure.
went begging for him back.
Jones might be there. There won't be any welcome back Chris Jones days in Edmonton, I don't think, anytime soon. Whether there'll be a spot on a sideline, with a guy like Milanovic or something as a DC, maybe that's in the future. But again, he's getting paid for the next year, so
Milanovic's job right now is to hold on to his own gig. So.
Yeah, we'll see whether he's there at that point. Of course, still going into week 7, 2 winless teams. The Elks and the Ticats will get to their games coming up this week. From the bottom of the league, we go to the top of the league. And the Montreal Alouettes had been rolling. They lose their quarterback and lose their first game of the season. Cody Fajardo. I know there's been a lot of talk about how great Vernon Adams had been. Listen, until Cody Fajardo lost a game, I still had him as the top guy in the league. I don't know what this does to MOP conversations. There's still a lot of football to be played, so we'll couch those right now. But a big blow to Montreal and a huge win for Toronto in Montreal. But what are you hearing about Fajardo's injury and what this does to the Alouettes after such a great start coming out of their Grey Cup championship?
Well, I mean, besides the loss, which I'm sure hurt, I mean, there was a lot of talk heading into that game, Huss, right, about the quick turnaround. There was only 5 days between their last game and this one. And they made, they didn't mince words throughout the week talking about how they felt it was a risk to their players' health. So to see, Keon Julian Grant also got injured in warm-up, another key contributor to the offense. He didn't play that game. To see Cody Fajardo grab his hamstring, we know hamstring injuries, have a lot to do with fatigue, with not stretching the muscles out, not working the lactic acid and stuff like that. After a grueling game the week before. As far as the loss goes, it's massive. It's like any other team out there. If they were to lose their starting quarterback, you go into a little bit of crisis mode. Tell yourself that you have the horses to kind of get by. And if you look at Montreal, I mean, I do like their other 2 phases in special teams is solid, and certainly their defense are one of the best in the league. But it just goes to show just how important, not just your offense, but your main guy is. And Cody Fajardo has taken on, a significant role with this team, not just by position, but by leadership. I mean, this guy is the heartbeat of the Alouettes. He is the pulse of this team. He's the guy that is in front of the cameras taking the heat, when the heat's needed, and the guy who shares praise with everybody. He's just a guy that you can look at and trust and feel composed, which is kind of wild to talk about Cody Fajardo. But that's what happens when you can you guide your team to a Grey Cup and you play as well as he did down the stretch last season. Taking him out, I mean, it's hard to kind of look to see where the Alouettes are right now. I mean, they're on the bye week, which certainly helps. I imagine Harris is probably looking at a few weeks here. I don't think, not coming back in that game and just knowing the way hamstrings are, even if you have a pulled hamstring, it's not something that you want to rush back to. So I would be very surprised if we saw Cody, back after this bye week, even practicing. I'm sure he's going to be out for a couple weeks, hopefully not for that team, but that seems to be where it's headed. Also too is, he's like, when you look at Caleb Evans coming in, that's a tough spot to come into. It's a tough, I know you're supposed to be ready. Every quarterback is supposed to practice as if they're starting, but certainly that's a tough one to come into. You don't have any time to, worry about your teammate or anything like that. And then Caleb Evans comes in and throws a pick 6. I mean, he did rally back from that afterwards with a long touchdown pass, and it looked like maybe the Alouettes were going to be in the fight, and then you just saw Montreal, or you just saw Toronto kind of take over from there. And with the crazy part about that too is, Haas, is Cameron Dukes didn't go out there and out-duke them. He only had like 100 and something passing yards. They shoved it down Montreal's throat. Kadeem Carey, I think, rushed for just under 100 yards, and they were, Dukes was also mobile with his feet. They pushed Montreal around, and that's the part for me that's concerning. As for, just to finish my thought on Caleb Evans, I think it bodes well that he has 15 starts under his belt in this league. He had 2. He was spent all last season with Montreal. He started 2 of those games when Harris was out. I believe he won both, or was at least 1-1 in those games. He started, I think, 10 games in the previous 2 years, as a member of the Ottawa Red Blacks. So I guess what I'm saying with that is that his experience will not make the moment too big for him. And I think with the bye week, for him to get into the playbook, to mentally focus and prepare to be the starter, I think you'll get a much better effort from Caleb Evans. And while coaches talk about how any quarterback can run the offense, and that's certainly true. You don't really have, every quarterback needs to run the offense that the team wants them to run. But there's no denying that different players bring different skill sets. And, Cody Fajardo, who's about as pocket of a passer as you're going to get in this league, he's not like Caleb Evans. Caleb Evans has, I would say he's a run first kind of guy. So we'll see what some extra preparation can do for him. And maybe with the other 2 phases, while they didn't have a great performance after Cody Fajardo left the game, if they can, kind of return to their old form and Caleb Evans can get by, I don't think this will be too big of an issue for Montreal, so long as it's only a few weeks.
Well, yeah, I'm with you. I mean, listen, they're still a really good team. However, the East is a lot more interesting after that game. I mean, totally. If Toronto had dropped a 3rd straight game, 2 of them to be in Montreal, and they got to 2-3, and the Alouettes are at 6-0, and we're almost in a situation like we were last year with the Argos running away with it at this point. It certainly does make it a bit more interesting. And, you mentioned just the way that the Argos throttled them on the line of scrimmage was a huge, huge part of the game, and it bodes very, very well for Ryan Dinwiddie's club. Staying in the East.
But Haas, before we even move on to the East, I forgot to even mention Janarian Grant and special teams for Toronto showed up again. Dude, and so just to spend a little bit of time on
Winnipeg
that
right now,
before we go to Dru Brown, just because there's a lot of talk about money and about availability for Janarian Grant. The fact of the matter is the Bombers could have had Janarian Grant if they wanted Janarian Grant this year. It wasn't I'm not saying they dislike Janarian. They had a ton of respect for him and certainly appreciate what he's done for this organization in the time that he's been here. And
so why did they move on?
They just felt like they had younger guys. They had guys that they felt that were younger, more durable. Janarian Grant did have injury issues all last season, right? When they put him into offense, he had that ankle injury. So, he's not old, but he's getting up there in age and just injury but it came down to look at all the returners that the Bombers brought into camp this year. They were constantly talking about returners. There's one guy, Aaron Cruikshank, who was the old Janarian Grant. So it was like he was supposed to replace him, and then none of those guys panned out. The fact of the matter is the Bombers could have got Janarian Grant. They could have got him around $80,000 this year. So it wasn't that they spent all this. I mean, that obviously is cheaper than the $60,000 you'd have to pay for a minimum guy, but by no means was money the issue. It was thinking that they had, they were leaving the player at the right time. And that's why Janarian Grant's in Toronto.
Every single time, for folks out of the market, every single time Janarian Grant gets a kick and takes it to the house, which has been often, the entire feed of Bomber fans is going, God damn it, how do we not have Janarian Grant anymore?
I wonder what the Bombers' record would be, Huss, if Janarian Grant was on that team. I know it's kind of a crazy thing to say, but when you look at all the close calls, when you look at the horrible field position that the Bombers had, particularly early on in the season, those things make big differences. And I think what angers a lot of Bomber fans is, the Bomber, Mike O'Shea, and this came out after like week 3 or 4, addressed this team knowing that they weren't going to be as good as other years. And so when the margin for error is smaller, you need to have a kicker and a punt returner. Why the Bombers didn't prioritize Janarian Grant, it's lost on me for sure.
The only thing I can say is they didn't think they could rely on him. I mean, from just how much he played. And listen, that's a real thing. I mean, that is a real thing. And if you have that many injury issues the year before, they just put him in bubble wrap until the games meant something at the end of the season. If you don't think that you're going to be able to rely on the guy, you go in a different direction, and that is what they did.
Can't get hurt if you don't get touched.
Dru Brown. Speaking of former Bombers, Dru Brown almost touching 5 bills, going for 480 and inevitably putting the final stake in Chris Jones in Edmonton. Breakout performance for Dru. And if you're turning on the rematch on Friday and what you think is booing, it could very well be Druing from the Red Black fans. What a performance from him, and a great start in the nation's capital as a starter for the first time in the 3-down loop.
Yeah, massive game for him. And I mean, it's even more impressive, Huss, the fact that this guy was still in concussion protocol to start the week. So he was kind of eased into practice after leaving the game midway through against the Bombers after taking that hit from Red Kramdian, the forearm to the head. So, protocol and whether or not he had any issues. I mean, clearly he didn't. He was cleared to play, but just the fact that he had to leave the last week's game to come out and throw the lights out. And you kind of felt that early too. And I don't know if that's the game, that clearly was the game plan, because I think they were expecting McLeod Bethel Thompson. That guy plays like a video game, as if you're in Madden football, man. I mean, he just throws the ball 50, 60 yards on every pass. So I think maybe that was probably by design, but wow, man. I mean, Dru Brown was, a lot of the talk coming out of camp was they were unsure about him, even though that he was the number one. They decided on him, obviously, as the starter. But one of the issues for him early on was trying to get chemistry with his receivers. While Dominic Rhymes had a fairly slow start to the season, he had a massive game. This ability to wake him up and get him going is huge for their offense. So they connected for 100 yards. This Khalil Pimpleton, this guy, there was some talk about him being, you hear about some guys on practice rosters. We heard about it. I mean, Dalton Schoen never had to occupy a practice roster spot, but he had a lot of hype coming out of training camp for the Bombers, went on to lead the entire league in receiving as a rookie. Well, this Khalil Pimpleton, when I was down in Ottawa, was another guy who they talked about. Not sure why he's not making the roster, but once he does, watch out. And his performance was off the charts. He's a guy that could be another big threat in this league. And so just to have Dru Brown come out and get on that page just for himself, for his, the confidence for himself, the confidence for the offense, the confidence for the team. I mean, I mentioned this on the show. I think it might've been our first show when I was out in Ottawa, was that's not an easy, it's a supportive quarterback room by all accounts. Dru Brown's getting the full support of his quarterback peers and certainly of his teammates. They see the work that he puts in, after hours, and they'll never question his preparedness. But that doesn't prevent him from being in one of, if not the most competitive quarterback rooms in the entire league. In that you have Jeremiah Masoli, who wants to come back and show the nation's capital the quarterback that he used to be and hasn't been able to after 2 back-to-back season-ending injuries. Dustin Crum, who spent a lot of time, as we talked about before, as a starter last season. You have Tyree Adams, who also got notable starts. So that's 4 quarterbacks that all want to get back to where they once were. And you can make the argument, of course, every quarterback wants to become the starter. And of course, that's true for the most part. This is one of those unique situations that they want it now. Like there isn't everybody has gotten their opportunity. So for Dru Brown to go out there and play the way that he played, that just is going to cement his role even further and continue on for a guy, as I mentioned before, has put a ton of work in and deserves every bit of success that he's getting right now.
Well, good news for Dru. He's got the Elks defense to go up against again this week. Kidding. It's a home and home. Although I'm fascinated to see what the Elks look like in this game.
Me too.
And obviously, how things look different if they do under Jarius Jackson. And maybe just if having Chris Jones not around anymore gives the guys a little bit more of a boost and gets them in the win column. But Dru has looked great so far this year. Happy for him and certainly happy for Bob Dice to get a nice start to the season and look to at least, get into being a competitive team in the East before we truly start talking about them as a Grey Cup contender. Well, from a guy that's finally getting his opportunity, the guy that he used to play behind, Zach Collaros here in Winnipeg, had a pretty ugly first month of the season. Missed the 5th game of the year where Chris Streveler came in and led the Bombers to their first win of the season. And I'll be honest, I have not talked more about a regular season game after the fact than last Friday's game, I think, in years. I mean, it had literally everything, but maybe most importantly for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, it had Zach Collaros looking like the guy that had been up for multiple MOP awards over the last few years, as opposed to a more tentative guy that didn't really click with a number of new receivers earlier in the season. Thoughts on Zach's performance and just how big that is to the Bombers, who are trying to turn it around and get over an ugly 0-4 start?
Yeah, I wrote in my 5 takeaways that I do after every game. It's not that Zach necessarily needed this, and I think you and I talked about this in my hit on Monday, where you kind of countered and said, well, maybe he did. I'm not saying he didn't need a good performance, but did he need a 344-yard performance, multiple touchdown performance? I think not necessarily personally. I don't think the confidence was lost in him, but I think the team needed it. I think the fans certainly needed it. I mean, you look at, the calls for Dru Brown after week 1. Now, that's just part of being a fan. But he wasn't playing well. He hadn't thrown a single touchdown pass since week 20 of last season. So anyone doing the math, that includes 2 playoff games, and 4 to start the year here. That's not really Zach Collaros' style. I mean, we're used to seeing him here in Winnipeg dominate, and we saw more of that. My biggest takeaway of that game, though, is ultimately, it speaks to Zach's performance, but it speaks to the offense as a whole, and that's marching down the field with minutes remaining in the game, going 100 and something yards to take the lead and then take that 2-point convert. That told me everything that we needed to know about the confidence of this group, because while the defense kind of came into the year as a bit of the question mark, they've been, I don't want to say a model of consistency. They certainly have had their ups and downs this season, but they've been a lot more consistent in their play than the offense. A unit that returned a bunch of players, including gave hefty raises, certainly has gone through injuries, obviously, with Kenny Lawler and Dalton Schoen sidelined right now. We'll get into Ontario Wilson later, but this is, I think Zach needed it for his own confidence, a little less than the team needed it and fans needed it. But I think all around, this is a great thing for them. I think this is a continuation of those, that stacking up wins, and getting the good feelings back in there, because I think things were starting, I don't think they were starting to break down, within those walls, but I think there were some players that were starting to question, why aren't reinforcements coming in? Why isn't Kyle Walters signing other players, and just questioning a little bit of what was going on, which is not what we've seen or been, I've heard for years, really, under this regime.
Hey, it was a very unfamiliar position for this Bomber team to be in. I mean, they had been pretty much unbeatable at home. I mean, they lose those games at home right off the bat. And listen, 0-4, they went into week 5 without Zach Collaros, staring an 0-5 record in the face. The last time the Bombers were 0-5 to start a season was the Jeff Reinbold year.
I was going to say, 1990s.
Where they started off 0-10 in 1998. And this era of Bomber football could not be farther from the Jeff Reinbold era, as much as I love the guy and love talking to him. So to get that win without Zach was huge, but then it was time for their QB1 to step up and bring them to a win. And as I said, that game had everything. I mean, it was so entertaining, I think, from a fan's perspective, because at times both offenses looked amazing. At times, they didn't look very good. Both defenses had huge moments and got absolutely torched at other times. He had a block punt. The only thing, I was talking to Dusty, who called the game afterwards, said the only thing that game didn't have was a kick or a punt return touchdown, but just about everything else. But for the Bombers to come back on that drive and a challenge of Mike O'Shea that may have saved the season in some ways, that, allowed them not to be punting from their goal line get a first down at the 20, and then Zach to go the next 90 yards late in the fourth quarter to get it. The first sack of the game by Jake Thomas and the final possession to get the ball back. And then for the offensive line and Brady Oliveira to say good night with a couple of first downs. A huge step forward for the Bombers.
What did that feel like, Huss? Felt like the last 3 years.
100%. I mean, that was Winnipeg Blue Bomber football. And that's a big reason as we transition into the Riders, that despite the fact that the Riders are 4-1 and the Bombers are 2-4, everyone seems to be betting the Bombers. The line right now at Coolbet is up to 3.5 on the road for Winnipeg. Certainly Trevor Harris's absence is a big part of that. But we haven't talked about BC. We haven't talked about Saskatchewan. I mean, BC is nuclear right now with this offense, and it's going to be tough for anybody to hang with them. I thought the Rider defense continues to show that it's one of the best units in the league, and they missed Trevor Harris. What do you make of the Riders situation with 4 wins in the bank, coming out of that loss to BC with a huge home game in what really could be, Jeff, the rubber match of the season series? More often than not, when both of the teams are relatively close, the Labor Day and the Banjo Bowl get split. This could be the difference between, as things continue, could potentially be the difference between a home field and a playoff game if the two teams are playing each other, or who's in and who's out.
I think it's a massive disrespect to the Roughriders, to be honest with you. Like you said, Huss, I mean, the Bombers, Zach looked good for long stretches of that game. The defense looked solid in their 3 takeaways, including 2 picks and a pick 6 from Dietrich Nichols, the first in his career. What a game he had. But still, I feel like they gave up a lot. They gave up a ton to Jake Maier. I mean, Jake Maier had a 300-yard game. I mean, they still gave up 37 points. And, BC, as you mentioned, they're chugging, man. They're chugging along. They look like the team that's going to capture the West. But just when you look at special teams and you look at the defense on Saskatchewan, I mean, that's a good unit. To go into Saskatchewan, it's a tough place to play. The Bombers always play them tight. To give Winnipeg, the 3.5 points on the road, that reeks to me like recency bias. But that being said, I mean, maybe the odds makers are onto something. Maybe they're ahead of us. Maybe what we saw from the Roughriders early in this season, I don't want to call a mirage, but when you play, when 2 of your games are against the Hamilton Tiger Cats and ultimately one of those games they served up to you on a platter, like, do we really know who the Roughriders are right now, even at 4-1? I mean, there's still plenty of season to go. But are they as good as they looked through the first 4 games? I mean, Shea Paterson certainly isn't a savior. I think he's maybe a bit better than what many people thought he might be, even with a pretty good preseason under his belt. But I just don't think he's nearly good enough, and I don't know if those 2 other phases will be good enough. I thought it was interesting to hear Corey Mace after the loss talk about how he didn't want his team to go undefeated. That he mentioned his 16-2 Argos that he was a part of last year, and that you learn the most, with the losses. Well, who knows? Maybe there's some more losses or some more learning lessons, if you will, coming the Saskatchewan's way. As for Winnipeg, I mean, this is the time that you need to turn it on. Things don't get easier for you. You head into Saskatchewan this week. You head into Toronto next week. Toronto's a tough place to play. It's not, they don't bring out the most fans out there, but they are a loud fan base. It's just for some reason the Argos play excellent football at home. And that's where you want to protect your house. But then it's a back-to-back against BC. So while the 2-4 looks a heck of a lot better than 1-5 and certainly 0-4 they were before, the Bombers can't take the foot off the gas. So maybe the odds makers are onto something. Maybe they see what Zach did that last game, thinks he can return to form, sees a defense that has 8 takeaways in the last 3 games, and thinks that they'll be able to top the Roughriders.
On the Monday Lock Shop, we were talking about the weekend in the Canadian Football League, and we guessed the lines before they had come out. And okay. I thought that the Riders would be a slight home favorite. Not put it this way, if these two teams, essentially. Yeah, 1 point or 1.5. So when it opened at Winnipeg -2, I was like, geez, I was off on that. But I thought it might get closer to a pick'em by the time we got to game time. It's going the other way. And, you mentioned recency bias. Certainly there's a recency bias into what the offense did last week, and we're going to get to the big part of that in just a second. The other part of it is I think the Bombers, because of just how good they were for 4 years, kind of got a mulligan on the first month of the season.
Yeah, a little bit.
But this is a different team, and they are going to be winning and losing close games. Sergio Castillo has been phenomenal since the Chip Balls fiasco of week number 1, and he's been a big part of the success that the team has had so far. But, I mean, this comes down to the loss of Trevor Harris. And
also the loss of Jamarcus Hardrick.
I was just about to bring that up. He's on that EIR, and I talked to Jamie Nye earlier today. They're worried that could be it for him. So
they're talking surgery.
A big loss for the Saskatchewan Roughriders, but a new culture, a new attitude around Saskatchewan right now with a new leader in Corey Mace. And the one thing you can count on is that nothing is coming easy against that Rider defense, which poses an interesting challenge to follow up a 200-yard performance by Pokey Wilson. I mean, a lot of the conversation about Collaros, to be honest, in the first month of the year was, especially with the Lawler injury and then Dalton Schoen going out, was who else was going to get the football. Well, we finally got that answer, and we got it in all caps. 16 targets, 13 catches, a circus catch during PI for a touchdown, and over 200 yards for Ontario Wilson. Is a star born, or is this just one of those anomaly games? But seriously, how important is it for the Bombers and Zach Collaros to find a new, reliable guy they can go to? Because the top 2 targets in a high-powered Winnipeg offense are both out, one of them for the season.
I'll take Elite, man. I think he's going to be special in this league. Now, whether he's going to be a Dalton Schoen, I'm not putting those kind of expectations on him, or that he'll one day be the next Kenny Lawler per se. But I think he showed, to your point. I mean, I think he had all different kinds of catches. They all looked smooth. They all had a level of difficulty to them, and he caught them with relative ease. And that was an impressive game for him. And to your point about, who was going to step up? Who was going to step up in the absence of Schoen and Lawler's injuries? Well, we have our answer now, and it's quite interesting that it's Ontario Pokey Wilson, as he'll be referred to now, Pokey, for probably the rest of his career. He was only targeted 8 times through the first, in the 4 games or 5 games he played. And even 2 weeks ago, when they were in Calgary, I don't think Zach Collaros even looked his direction. So to then get 16 targets, to get twice as many targets as you had before, goes to show that he's obviously earned the trust of Zach Collaros. At what point, whether it was in that week of working, that week of practice leading into the game, or if he just felt like he was coming after the ball and pinpointing the ball well during the game, or a combination of both, Zach just kept going back to him. Now, I'm sure there was some extra protection on guys like Nick Dembski and even Drew Wolitarsky to a certain degree, the 2 veteran players in that receivers group. But for, at some point in time during the game, they switch. I mean, by catch 7 or 8,
pay
you start
attention
going,
to that guy.
Okay, maybe this guy is the guy that they're looking to go to. And you just look at some of his performance during that game, Huss. I think he had, a modest showing in the first quarter. I think he had a couple catches, maybe totaling 20, 30 yards, and he got progressively better. He saved his best for last. In that fourth quarter, where I think he reeled in like 6 balls for 80-something yards, and really was attention to detail and a big part of a lot of those drives, those key drives down the stretch. So there's a guy who I think can do a lot of, certainly showed he can do a lot of special things. We talked about this on your show on Monday, that I mentioned the guys like Carlton Agadosi comes out and has has a great game against the then dominant Calgary Stampeders, and everyone's all excited about him. to me, and I'm not trying to downplay that performance, but using the benefit of hindsight, that was a really, really tall guy pinpointed in the end zone twice. Ontario Wilson was getting open, and even when he wasn't open, was making incredible catches. So we'll see what happens here. We'll see what the fallout is for even a guy like Lucky Whitehead, who was recently signed. See if he can get into the lineup. But right now, I mean, the situation with Kenny Lawler, likely back in August. I was told a couple weeks ago that they didn't believe that he would return in July. So if you're looking at a return date, it's probably one of those BC Lions games. So we'll see what happens there. But, with the good news with Wilson and Kenny Lawler coming back, it's still going to hurt to not have Dalton Schoen in the lineup, but it hurts a hell of a lot less if you can have guys like Wilson step up the way.
And by the way, shout out to producer Michael Remus. For those of you that are watching on YouTube as opposed to the podcast, Remus has the picture of Pokey Wilson. I'm looking close and I'm like, what's the background? And then I remembered listening on Winnipeg Sports Talk yesterday to his answer as to why he is nicknamed Pokey. And it's because I think his mom or his grandma said he looked like a little Pokemon as a kid. And that was the name going forward. So
it just shows us how old we are, eh? This guy's an adult in the CFL, and they're talking about how he looked like a Pokemon. Like, I'm not into Pokemon. I'm sure it's been around for quite some time, obviously, but holy smokes.
It's funny when you think about that. I think Pokemon, the catch tag, the tag is you got to catch them all. Well, the Calgary Stampeders are running around trying to catch Pokey Wilson all Friday night, 13 times on those receptions for 200 yards last week. Breakout performance and offensive player of the week in the Canadian Football League. You're listening to CFL 110, presented by Garage Living Winnipeg. You can touch base with them at 204-999-1234 for a free in-garage consultation. And make sure to check out their website for the amazing work they do at garageliving.com. Hammer, just on the way out, I got to mention that line in the Bomber game. Let's take a quick look at the CoolBet lines for our friends over at CoolBet Canada. Every week, 20% win boost. Your choice of CFL bets, whether you want to do a parlay, whether you want to just pick one particular game. Every week, you got a 20% win boost to add to your bet. So choose wisely. The Red Blacks are 2.5-point favorites at home against the Elks in the rematch without Chris Jones on the sidelines. They mentioned this Bomber line continues to rise, and this is the exact same thing that happened last week. By the way, like if you'd got on the Bombers at -3.5 early in the week, the line was closed at 6.5 for Winnipeg. So people want to bet Winnipeg, and maybe that's because there's a lot of cool bettors in this area. I'm not sure. But a big middle opportunity. And if you bet the Bombers at 3.5 and then bet the Stamps at 6.5, you won both your bets because they did win by 4. But that's at 3.5 right now in Saskatchewan. The interesting line movement of the week, I have to admit, is the Argos. Toronto opened as 4.5-point favorites, right where I thought that it would be. It's been bet down to 3. And I know Hamilton hasn't won before, but I think it kind of gives me the feeling of Bomber Rider games where often you can throw out the records. This Hamilton team, though, is going to be an absolutely desperate team, and it seems like maybe some people are jumping on that. I wouldn't be surprised if this was a real tight one. Had to put in my picks early on at the 4.5 line, and I did take Hamilton, holding my nose while I did it.
You did take Hamilton. Okay, so this is the week. This is the week.
Take Hamilton plus 4.5. Well, I'm not saying they're going to win the game. I just
you got
think
him at plus 4.5. You got him early. Okay.
Yeah, plus 4.5. Now it is plus 3. And the line that hasn't moved at all, the BC Lions, 4.5-point favorites in Calgary. I'll be honest. I like watching what Winnipeg did to the Calgary defense last week, knowing what BC's doing right now and what they did to Saskatchewan, putting up 35 against a very good defense last week. I thought that would be closer to a touchdown. I will be certainly on BC this week, but
Calgary's going to have to be hoping for a snowstorm.
Yeah, well, that's about the only thing I think can stop the Lions right now. So again, Edmonton, Ottawa, Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, Toronto, Hamilton, BC, Calgary. The Alouettes bye comes at a great time with Cody Fajardo on the mend. And as of this week, your Grey Cup favorites on the odds board, BC now, plus 225, Montreal plus 250, a big gap, and then the Argos at 5-1, and the Blommers at plus 550, the Riders at plus 575, And then another gap, Ottawa 15-1, Calgary 22-1, Hamilton and Edmonton at 100-1. And that sort of plays out. I mean, we've got two elite teams right now that really look to be the favorites in the two divisions. You got this next group, Toronto, Saskatchewan, Winnipeg, and then the other teams that are really trying to get a little bit more traction going forward. Should be a great weekend. As I mentioned, our first doubleheader on Friday. I can't wait for it.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing, just with the soap opera that the Elks have been, like, what's going to happen here, right? I mean, what is going on in those walls right now? Are they going to rally together for, Geroy Simon and Jarius Jackson? You often hear and see, for the most part, that new coaching bump, or are they going to get their asses handed to them in Ottawa? It's hard to tell, and I think that's indicative of the entire league, Huss. I mean, you can look at the BC Lions, yes, they're one of the more consistent teams, to be sure, but everybody else, man, it's like throwing a blind dart, man, hoping to hit a bullseye, because it's just, the reason why I think the odds are so close is just because I said this before, and I don't, I'm a bettor in my own right, but, giving advice for betting is, it doesn't make me uncomfortable, but if any advice, bet live. Because personalities of games change so drastically. Like, you could have, for instance, had the Ottawa Redblacks at plus 12.5 at one point and the Edmonton Elks at plus 8.5 at key points in those games. And that was, to me, going to be a very close game all the way through. And so it's just, again, it's not so much even about the betting as much as it is about the state of the league. I think there is so much parity in this league. We all know it's, teams are better at home. So, while the BC Lions look like they could be a slam dunk again this week, you never know, man. You just never know in this league. And what makes the 3-down game so exciting is that you never know who's going to show up, who's going to have a big game, what phase of each team is going to have a massive game. We know how important special teams are. So, those can often, tilt the tables. So it's just another week of a great slate of games, and we'll talk about it all after next week. And that's the beauty of this league. There's no shortage of drama, just like there's no shortage of action week in and week out.
Yeah, no Thursday game, but a doubleheader Friday and primetime games between the Argos and Ticats on Saturday, and in the West Sunday between the BC Lions and the Calgary Stampeders. Hammer, thanks so much. Always a pleasure. We'll do it again next week. Thanks again to our sponsor, Garage Living Winnipeg at 999-1234 for their support of CFL 110. Tell a friend about it. Let them know where they can find the podcast. Just search CFL 110 wherever you get your favorite pods. And give us a sub over here at the Winnipeg Sports Talk channel. More CFL content on our daily show at 1 p.m. Central each and every day. Winnipeg Sports Talk Daily. For Jeff Hamilton, I'm Andrew Paterson. Enjoy the games this week, and we'll see you next week right here on CFL 110.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.